Well, thank you, everyone, for attending. I'm Wendy Poole, and I'm here with my colleague Gerald Fallon from the Department of Educational Studies in the Faculty of Education at UBC. And we're presenting today on the subject of the emerging fourth tier in K-12 education in BC. And we're interested in looking at the implications for social justice there. So we're making an argument that there's a fourth tier in education emerging. The purpose of our study is to examine, well, first of all, the study is part of a larger research agenda that examines market-driven funding policy in BC. And the study emerged out of our concern that public education is becoming increasingly privatized in British Columbia, and we're concerned about the possible negative implications that that might have for social justice. So the purpose of the study, this particular study, is to examine one technology, international student tuition, that technology for implementing entrepreneurial, or what we're calling market-driven, education finance policy in British Columbia. So in the presentation, we compare levels of IST, international student tuition, generated by school districts across the province. There are 60 school districts in the province. We have limited this study to IST because of the unavailability of disaggregated financial data related to other sources of market-driven or entrepreneurial revenue sources. So we discussed the comparative impact of differential levels of IST revenue generation and its implications for social justice at the local or the district level. So what we are arguing in this presentation is that market-driven funding mechanisms, and in the case of this paper, especially IST, are technologies of privatization that are operating within BC's public education system, and which may be leading to the emergence of a fourth tier of education. So in other words, a further stratification of education in addition to an already existing 3 tiers. So let me explain what we mean by that. Okay, so we're seeing that there are 3 tiers that exist in BC education already. So these are the first 3 tiers that you see on the screen. Tier 1 consists of schools that normally we would call private schools that are funded exclusively from private sources. Now, Tier 2 schools exist in BC and are called independent schools. And these are schools that are subsidized by the provincial government at either the level of 35% or 50% of the local district's public grants. And that, we could explain that later if you're interested, but it depends on how much spending the school does per student. If they spend more per student than the government grant to the local public school district, then they get funded at the lower level, the 35% level. So those are subsidized schools. They receive government subsidies. And then Tier 3 schools are what we would normally call public schools, and these are traditionally fully funded by government. However, those kinds of schools, those fully public schools, are slowly disappearing, and it could even be argued that there aren't any schools anymore that are able to fund themselves solely from government revenue. So we're arguing that there's kind of a Tier 4 that's emerging here, and that these are public schools that are partly funded by market-driven or entrepreneurial funding mechanisms, resulting in privatization within public education, and which are exacerbating stratification within the system. Okay, so what do we mean by market-driven funding mechanisms? Well, after its election in 2001, the Liberal government here introduced the following policies, among many others. But they introduced, first of all, what we are calling market-driven public funding. And this means a per-student enrollment-based operating grant. Okay, so the school districts get operating grants per student, and it's this policy was also coupled with school choice policy. So they opened the catchment area boundaries so that students could move between schools and between school districts to attend whatever school they wanted to, as long as there was space available. So those two things together, the decision to make funding available on a per-student basis, as well as moving to a school choice model, created a competitive environment within the province, within education, that is now being driven by student and parent demand. Okay? So students and parents choose what school they want to go to, and this has implications for schools and school districts because of the enrollment-based funding formula. The more students a school and a district can attract, the more funding they're going to get. And this is where the competition comes in and the stress on schools and school districts. Okay, so that's the public funding piece. Schools are competing for funds from the provincial government. And then secondly, there's a market-driven private funding formula that is coupled with this system. So it runs in parallel to this system. And this is a policy that enables school districts to generate supplementary revenue from private sources. And in this case, the case of this paper, we're looking at private revenue that comes from international student tuition. So that gets coupled with a differential local district capacity. And this is what we're arguing in our paper, that not every school district has the same capacity to generate IST funding and other kinds of project funding as well, we believe. And so this is also creating some sort of stratification within the province as a result of market-driven funding. So this is what we're going to be discussing throughout the paper. So I'm going to turn things over now to Gerald.
Sorry, I have a cold. Okay, so in terms of framework, we have used the notion of marketization and privatization of public education and also social justice to guide our analysis of data and also to develop the research design for this research. So in terms of marketization and privatization, several authors have discussed the various ways of understanding the notion of marketization and privatization. In general, when you look at all of these authors, you see that they make the point that the notion of privatization is a multifaceted concept, and it might refer to private control, incentives, and decision-making over public administration through different market mechanisms like decentralization, consumer choice, competition, and also diversification of funding sources toward a mix of private and public sources. But more specifically, we focus on the studies of Lubinsky and also the work, based on the work of Wendy and Poole, to argue that the introduction of market-like behavior in schools refer as marketization of public schools, and a shift toward a mix of public and private sources of funding represent de facto privatization. So in BC, when we look at the current situation, especially since 2001, since the educational reform through Bill 34, we're saying that marketization and privatization of funding are occurring in tandem in public schools through the market-driven funding mechanism for public funding and for private funding. In terms of understanding of the various dimensions of social justice, we based our work on Nancy Fraser, especially in 1995 and also its most recent one in 2008. According to Fraser, there are three major dimensions of social justice. It has an economic, which we call here redistributive component, a cultural based on the notion of recognition, and a political based on the notion of participation into decision-making. So for the purpose of our study, we focus on the economic dimension of social justice in terms of redistribution, because we see that when we do the analysis of the different levels of ISP, we find out that there is a misdistribution of resources, which leads to inequities in terms of access to various services and programs.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but
yes.
we aren't seeing anything if you've got the presentation you're making, and it's also very difficult to hear.
Oh, we have a slideshow going on, Larry, right now. I'll try to speak louder because my voice is not very good today. Can you hear me well now?
I can hear you better, but the slides should be, shown up with one.
Right. Yeah.
So.
I know that there's somebody at UBCIT is recording the session, so I should be able to send you the slides later, but right now we don't have any tech support, so I'm sorry I can't really, make that presentable to you at this point.
Okay, so I'll keep going. So building on Fraser's argument, we argue that inequities in funding are interconnected with cultural inequities and social injustices by impeding equal participation in making substantive decisions in the education system. And also we argue that because education impacts people's lives materially, socially, culturally, and politically, therefore the pursuit of social justice through the public system requires that marginalized groups must be fully enabled to participate in making decisions about education, especially including those related to educational aims and also the operationalization in terms of funding of education. And this is why we see funding as quite central as one of the policy technology used to privatize the system. In terms of methodology, we use critical document analysis, and our main sources of data were financial documents from school district, government, and also non-governmental organizations. In terms of analysis, first, our analysis focused on comparing average levels of international student tuition, IST, generated per district annually from 2007 to 2012. And then we used, to get that data, we used mainly financial documents published by the Minister of Education to determine the level of IST. And also we have some tables that you have, Table 1, Table 2, that provide that data. And we use also other ministry documents to find student enrollment per district, and also we use these pieces of information to calculate the IST per student per capita for each year. So this is how, because you can look at the overall, like you could take Vancouver, $16 million, but when you look per capita, it might be $282. And then you look at other districts like West Van, the overall take might look very much smaller, but the per capita is close to $1,300 on top of the public grant. So per capita gives you a better reading of the inequities that are being built in the system. Second, we analyze data from Statistics Canada related to household income, and also ministry data in relation to the percentage of Aboriginal students enrollment in each district. And from that data, we ranked school districts in terms of their levels of ISP per student capita, and categorized them in the highest 10, middle 10, and the lowest 10 school districts, always in terms of ISP fund generated through the program. And then we look at patterns that emerge in relation to the percentage of regional students and household income, and also the geographical location of districts in each of those categories. And you will see later on when we talk about the findings, there's a very interesting trends coming up out of that, the interaction of those four variables.
Okay, so if you refer to Table 2, I'll just briefly ask you to pay attention to, let's see, what would it be, Table 2. Column 5, the one that's called International Student Tuition, IST, per FTE student average over 5 fiscal years, from 2007-08 to 2011-12. So if you refer to that column while we're going through this, I think this will help you. For those listening, if you want to contact us later, we can give you our email addresses, and we can send you copies of these slides as well as copies of the tables for your reference. So we apologize if you're not able to see these things today. So one of our first findings is that the lowest 10 districts in Table 2, so if you look at how it's divided into 3 parts, which continues on to the back of the page. So we're referring to the lowest 10 districts at the bottom of the page and onto the second page right now. The lowest 10 districts in Table 2 generate 0 or negligible levels of IST per capita, while the 10 highest districts at the top of the first page generate between $356 and about $1,350 of international student tuition per capita or per student. Okay? So there's a huge discrepancy here across school districts. So we're seeing marked stratification across school districts in terms of the level of IST that they are able to generate. And so this is indicative of a hierarchy of advantage and disadvantage across different districts. Okay, the second finding relates to IST and the level of community affluence. And what we are finding is that the more affluent the community, the more IST they seem to be able to generate by the school district. And we're not making any claims about causality here, but we do see that pattern that's emerging in our data. For example, if you find West Vancouver School District, which is, according to Statistics Canada, the most affluent school district in BC, it generates approximately $1,350 per student more than Haida Gwaii Queen Charlotte, which is one of the least affluent districts in the province. So again, these represent huge disparities in funding. $1,350 per student may not sound like a whole lot of money, but when you consider the size of the student population and so on, these end up representing some pretty large numbers. For example, if you look in the fourth column, you'll see the total amount of revenue that the districts are able to generate with those funds. And you can see that there is a huge discrepancy. So over about $8.5 million generated in West Vancouver versus 0 in some of these other districts that generate none. So huge discrepancies. Okay, Gerald.
And the other variables we looked at was to look at the percentage of Aboriginal students enrolled in each of these districts. And again, this is not a cause to effect, okay, so let's be clear about that. It's just a trend that is emerging right now. But what we find out is that the districts with a higher percentage of Aboriginal students were the ones who generated the lowest level of IST. Okay, now the question is, are they actively pursuing IST? We looked at some of the websites of some of the districts, and some are, but some are not. By choice, we don't know yet, you know, but the trend is there. And for instance, here we gave you the example of the 10 top districts generating the highest IST, and then they had fewer than 10% of Aboriginal students enrolled in their total student population. And at the lowest end, in terms of IST still, and we mean by that between 0 to about $4.20 per student, the percentage of Aboriginal students range between 25 to 99%. Okay, again, it's just a trend. And also we look at the geographical location of those districts. And again, what we find out is that the districts that are located in urban centers, southern part of the province, for instance, or the southern part of the Vancouver Island, they're very close to urban center and also all the sporting and cultural events and so on. Again, the trend is that they generate more IST funding than districts who are located in more remote locations, a bit hard of access. And what we're saying here is that the trend seems to indicate that the geographical location might contribute to differential capacity between districts to generate IST funding, because the argument here is that when you look at the policy, it looks neutral. It's always looked neutral. So the government is enabling the existence of that kind of competing market for IST dollars. But in the system, there's already a built-in differential capacity among districts to generate acceptable level of IST. So basically, what we looked at is the interaction of those four variables, and what we have just communicated to you is the trends that we have found so far with regard to capacity, to the impact of those variables on, well, the perceived impact of those variables on the capacity of individual districts to generate IST funding.
Okay, so essentially what we're arguing then is that all of these things are related. So if a school district is located in a prime geographical position within the province, if they're affluent, and if they have low numbers of Aboriginal students, they seem to be the most advantaged in terms of being able to generate IST. And then vice versa of that is true as well. So there are some serious implications, we think, about this. First of all, we're talking here about privatization within a publicly funded education system, and that is significant here. So we're not talking about public schools becoming fully owned by private individuals or groups. We're talking about a public system becoming privatized within. We're seeing increased stratification among school districts in this public system. And public schooling is meant to be an equalizer. So this has serious implications for social justice if they don't have equal capacity to generate this kind of extra funding. So there's an exacerbation of socioeconomic hierarchies, because it seems to be the least affluent school districts who are least able to generate IST, or at least who do generate lower levels of IST. Again, we don't know if it's a cause-effect relationship or not yet. But we are concerned that this is reproducing cultural, social injustices because of the link geographically, economically, and socially to Aboriginal communities. So potentially, all of the above may create challenges for participatory democracy for marginalized groups and communities. If they don't have the additional funding that other school districts have, then they may have less capacity to engage in decision-making at the local level that will enable them to meet their specific needs. So that concludes our presentation. Thank you very much.